good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us from, and Happy New Year also from our side. And a welcome back to our webinar series under the e-mobility support and investment platform for Asia and the Pacific. We're excited to be here again with a new year and a new series of webinars. So my name is Johanna Siljakus. I work for the Transport Sector Office at the Asian Development Bank. And today we'll be kicking off the series with today's webinar, Accessibility as a Tool for Monitoring EV Deployment by Emily Moylan from the University of Sydney. I'll present her in just a bit, but before that, I'd like to give you a couple of words of introduction. So this webinar is organized under, as I mentioned, under the umbrella of the e-mobility support and investment platform for Asia and the Pacific. This is a knowledge sharing platform that aims to build capacity and support the scale up of financing of e-mobility initiatives. The platform is managed by ADB, and it's supported by the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, and UNEP. And if you would like to join the e-mobility community, e-mobility community under the platform, in order to stay up to date on the platform's activities, you can fill in this assessment survey that we have. In the end of the survey, you can leave us your contact details in case you have not done so already, and we will add you to our mailing list. You can see the QR code to the survey now on the screen. We can also share a link to it a bit later along in the webinar. So if I can have the next slide, thanks. So just very briefly, our next webinar coming up in 2 weeks' time will be with Professor Mubin Ahmad. He will be talking about geofencing for urban mobility. So we'll hear more about this kind of more high-tech topic next week. And then a couple of words on house rules. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So to ensure a smooth webinar session, we have disabled all microphones of the attendees. However, at the end of the session, that we will definitely have time for Q&A and a discussion. So please send us your questions through the Q&A function, which is available at the bottom of your screens. Or should be available there. It's a box with a question mark. And you can send us questions throughout the presentation, and I'll pick them up at the end of the session and move over to when we are moving over to the discussion phase. Please also note that this webinar session is recorded and it will be shared online. So let me now introduce you to our speaker for today's session, Emily Moylan. So Emily is a senior lecturer in transport at the University of Sydney, and she specializes in data-driven models for assessing multimodal system performance. She has over a decade of experience in academia and research, focusing mainly on transport engineering and sustainable mobility. So yes, without further ado, let me hand over to Emily for her presentation. And as mentioned earlier, please do send us your questions throughout the session and we'll get to them at the end of Emily's presentation. Thank you, Emily. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Are the slides looking correct and you can hear me? All good?
Yes, we can hear you and the slides are in presentation mode. Thanks.
Right. So Johanna's done a great job introducing me, and I need to start because, as you'll hear in the presentation, the methodologies that I'm presenting to you are inherently place-based methodologies. So I need to start by acknowledging the First Nations people of the land where we did this research, which would be the very diverse Aboriginal groups in New South Wales. But in particular, I wanted to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that the University of Sydney sits on and where I am right now, which is at my home. I also would like to start by saying thank you to Joanna for setting this up, and to ADB for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm speaking here with a few different hats on, I guess as the lead CI of a project that we did at the University of Sydney in conjunction with the New South Wales Department of Planning a couple of years ago. And these were the various investigators involved in the project, 5 of them from the university, and Claudine was from the Department of Planning and Environment. So they all deserve credit for the research that I'm presenting to you today, but especially Bamin Lahorpur, who was a postdoc working on this, and he's the one who generated most of the plots that I'm going to be sharing with you. The context for this was that it was work that was done for the New South Wales government, and it was done in Australia, but I'm hoping that there's going to be relevance to any of you who are working in any countries across Asia, or I guess globally. And I need to give you a little bit of context about what's happening with e-mobility in Australia. I would say Australia has a late start, so it's the red line down there towards the bottom, in contrast with leaders like Norway or ones that have shown incredible recent growth like China. So this is IEA's EV Outlook data from 2023. But there are similarities. So all of the countries that weren't explicitly included in the EV Outlook data are shown in green at the bottom. So maybe Australia is slightly ahead, so to speak. And the reasons why Australia is maybe not as far along as you might expect for a country with Australia's wealth has to do with a lot of things. It's a left-hand drive country. It's a quite limited market, high purchase price of vehicles, and very low population density all contribute to a slow uptake on EVs. So just to give you an understanding of what I'm talking about when I talk about low density, this would be something that would be different from many other Asian countries. Australia is shown there on the right in comparison to the Indonesian archipelago. The data that we're talking about today is relevant to New South Wales. That's the little outline. I drew that by hand. That's not the actual outline of New South Wales. It's my approximation. So New South Wales is Australia's largest state by population, with about 8.2 million residents. And it has just over half of the area of Indonesia. So you can compare the 280 million residents of Indonesia to the 8.2 of New South Wales. And the reason why we have such disparate densities is because there's large portions of the state that look like that picture on the left, which I stole from the Tourism Bureau of Burke, which is a rural town out in the west of the state. So Australia is a very highly urbanized country at 86.6% urban. That's more urbanized than the United States, UK, Norway, Germany, France. But the way that it is so urban is that it has lots of areas that really don't have a lot of development in them. Areas like I've shown on the left here. And that's something that historically has been a big problem for Australia because of the role of range anxiety with EV batteries. And I think maybe more than that, a fundamentally a self-perception of that we are a rural country, that even though most people in New South Wales live in Sydney, they still think of themselves as people who may need to drive very long distances without towns along the way in a rural state. And so that's contributed to the way that we think about ourselves and our vehicle purchase and our infrastructure rollout. So we were thinking about the recent work that's been done in policy space about EV deployment in New South Wales, and thinking about the way that charging infrastructure and vehicle and battery technology are sort of a chicken and an egg problem. It's not really worth developing the vehicles and the batteries. Nobody's going to buy them until the charging infrastructure is there. It's not worth putting the charging infrastructure in until there's a critical mass of vehicles. And those two are going to play off of each other in kind of interesting ways. So the project that I'm talking about today is mostly about that intersection between the gray circle and the green circle. And by the end of the project, I'm going to start talking about everything else. And the everything else ends up being very important. It has to do with policy, human behaviors. It has to do with economic markets and political will, social license from people, from voters to enact these kinds of changes, and then a whole history having to do with the land use patterns that we've created over decades or centuries of human development in these areas. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce to you the methodology that we used for this, and there's a long backstory about why we're using methods like this, but what I'm presenting here are the equations that describe the methodology of accessibility, and in particular, I'm talking about cumulative opportunity accessibility. So conceptually, if you start on the left where you are at the red dot and you say, how many opportunities can I reach? Then you could draw an isochrone, which would be the distance along the network that you can travel in a fixed amount of time or a fixed distance. And that creates that kind of beige or orange outline. And then if you wanted to know what you can access, it's all of the opportunities that fall in that orange area. So all of the green dots are inside the orange area, all of the gray dots are outside of the orange area. And the equations that we have for summing that up are just the summation over the opportunities. We choose to have a binary impedance function. That's the function of the cost is 1 or 0, which means you're either inside the catchment or outside the catchment. And then once we have the summation of opportunities at every location, at every red dot, then we can say, well, we can combine all of those red dots by weighting the access experienced at that red dot by the number of people who live at the red dot. So that's the basic concept of accessibility. This is widely used in transport planning and geography. Hopefully it's something everybody on the call has come across before. And we were motivated to use this because there's two things here. It allows us to look at spatial equity. So it allows us to see that some places have better access and some places have worse access. And the other thing that it does is that it speaks fundamentally to the concept that the transportation system does not exist for itself. Transportation is a derived demand. We only build transportation networks because they allow us to access other things like education, employment, healthcare, social opportunities, whatever they are. And so this was a way that we could talk about spatial equity while focusing on the fact that nobody actually wants access to the charger. They only want access to the things that the charger allows them to access. And so when we were thinking about this project, we considered various kinds of opportunities that are relevant to the questions around EV deployment. And some of them are more interesting than others, but the ones that I've brought with me today are access to general population. And by way of that, we're also going to be talking about access to chargers. And the reason that I'm going to be presenting the slides on general population is because it scales really well with access to everything else. Like if you wanted to look at access using an electric vehicle to grocery stores or hospitals, they tend to be very highly correlated with access to population. So it's a nice thing to look at. And most places, including Australia, would have some kind of spatial population data through a census that would allow this kind of entity to be calculated in a way that other measures like hospitals or education maybe wouldn't be able to be calculated. Okay, so the data, and maybe this is something we need to come back to if any of you are interested in using these methodologies in your context, have to include something about all of the opportunities that you're going to write. So in our reach, and so in our context, that would be population from the Australian census. For travel costs, we're looking at shortest path distances through the road network. And this is a nice feature of this because we're very interested in battery range. Battery range is generally measured in kilometers. And so we're interested in distance, which means we don't even need information about the network, about speeds and travel times. And then if we want to combine these values and compare them, we would want to be able to weight those accessibilities by the population that experiences those accessibilities. And so then we're back to using census data as well. So it's pretty straightforward data collection and one that would work in a lot of different contexts. And so now I'll show you what you can do with these methodologies that answers questions about EV deployment in a country that is just starting the deployment of electric vehicles. So this is the state of New South Wales, and this is what access with electric vehicles looks like. So you start with the assumption that you have some range on your battery, and we'll choose a very low range here, 50 kilometers. And then you say, with the 50-kilometer charge on your battery, how far can you get, and how many people or social opportunities will you be able to reach with that? And no surprises, if you live in Sydney, that's that purple circle in the bottom, you can reach a lot of people in Sydney in 50 kilometers. And if you live out in a more rural area, then there's not that many people that you can reach within a 50-kilometer battery range. But as you increase the range on your battery, that is going to kind of even out and increase. So there's a lot more area and therefore a lot more population that can reach almost everybody when you're looking at a really large battery range, something in the 500-kilometer range. And so this is a way of kind of showing how battery range specifically feeds into accessibility and therefore into spatial equity. And this is the same map. I think that's literally the same map. Sorry, the slides aren't advancing well. Just gonna click ahead. There we go. So this is a graphical visualization of exactly the same map. So if we just start with the plot on the left, on the horizontal axis, we've got the range of the electric vehicle battery going from 50 to 500 kilometers. And on the vertical axis, we have the population that can be accessed with that vehicle. Now, I'm showing 3 lines here. The middle one in blue is the person-weighted average. So that means that you take every single place in the state, you weight the number of people that live in that place times the access that that place experiences. You get an average over the entire state. And you see that as the battery range increases, then that person-weighted access also increases going left to right. But we've also shown a yellow line for the 10th percentile and a purple line for the 90th percentile. And this is showing what you could think of as the unluckiest and luckiest spatially located person, or 10 percentile decile of people. And so a good way of thinking about it is the purple line represents the kind of people who live in inner Sydney, and the yellow line would represent people who live in more rural neighborhoods. And so you can see that as you increase the battery range, the access is going to grow no matter what, but the access is growing faster for the average person and for the luckiest people than it is for the unlucky people. Even with large battery ranges, the people who are in very remote areas are still not going to be able to access everyone else in the state because it's a large state. Now, if we move over to the plot on the right, that's the exact same plot, but in this one, instead of allowing that battery range, we have allowed the vehicle to stop at a publicly available charger, knowing where the publicly available chargers are in the state, and recharge one time, which effectively doubles the range, moderating for the fact that there may not be a charger available exactly after 500 kilometers. And the important thing here is that the lines converge. They converge at around 300 kilometers. And so we're seeing this really tight grouping between the luckiest and the unluckiest people. And this tells us that despite differences that persist with increased battery technology, we can actually mitigate those differences, those spatial inequalities, with an appropriate set of chargers. And those chargers, those are the chargers that are publicly available and exist today in New South Wales. And editorializing, that is not very many chargers. So it doesn't take that much to be able to reach this state where you're no longer experiencing strong spatial inequalities due to battery range. Just to provide a little bit of context, I have these little icons of the cars along there, and those cars have tiny dates on them. They say 2010, 2014, 2018, and 2021, because those are the years where a new kind of high-end electric vehicle would have been sold with that battery range. So you can see that that convergence around 300 kilometers, that's actually associated with sort of the high-end cars that were on the market in 2018. And are then, persisting in the market, and now even larger ranges are being sold in the Australian context. Okay, so that kind of summarizes how this methodology, this accessibility framework, can be applied to questions of electric vehicle deployment in a context like Australia, where there's fairly low levels of charging infrastructure and a sort of history and culture around range anxiety and long distance trips. Now, you may have noticed that this was all based on the assumption that everybody is beginning their journey at home, and they're beginning it with a full charge on their battery. And that was something that we wanted to investigate a little bit more. And it turns out that home charging is quite a controversial topic, and I imagine that's true in many contexts across Asia. So in our context, it works like this. There's an acknowledgement from the government that not everybody would have off-street parking available where they could install a charger if they needed to. And so there is a policy that there are going to be publicly available chargers within 5 kilometers of every home. And I just want to flag that there. This is, part of the electric vehicle strategy for the state. And you'll probably recall that 5 kilometers does not get you very far when you're talking about some of the more rural communities that we have in our state. But talking about the more urbanized areas, I wanted to give you a picture of what Sydney housing stock looks like in the built environment that we have. So we have many houses that are built in the Victorian period shown on the left, and those can range from very high-end luxury houses that may have some parking accessed by a back laneway to what was originally built as workers' cottages, that's shown on the bottom left, and these would not have any off-street parking. There are large areas in inner Sydney that would be just entirely made of this kind of housing stock, or other urban forms that don't have off-street parking. Newer developments tend to look a little bit more like the examples on the right, and those can be single-family homes, and they're extremely car-oriented with forward-facing car garages, easy to install EV chargers, and then lots of buildings that we would class together as strata buildings, meaning that development on that building would be controlled by a committee with residents on it, and their charging would need to occur in probably an underground car park in this context. And there's been a lot of controversy about that in New South Wales, about risks with battery fires and costs of power system upgrades. So that's kind of the context that we're looking at. We used property sales data, which generally includes information about whether or not there's off-street parking available at the property. We had 5 years of data to look at this, and you can see that generally it's something in the 20–30% that have no parking available at the site. The histogram in the top right shows what the typical number of parking spaces is at a property. It would generally be 1, sometimes 2. Anything more than that is pretty unusual, but there are a substantial number with 0. And when we kind of aggregate those up into statistical areas, so that's the second smallest spatial aggregation in the census data, you can see that really most people have a lot of, that's the bar at the left, they have access to some parking. And then as you go off to the right, there's this tiny little blip over at 1, and those are little neighborhoods. So each piece of information in this histogram is a neighborhood. Neighborhoods where literally nobody has parking available off street. And so we got a bit interested in those and started looking at how those vary across the state. So this is the state of New South Wales, and the red dots are publicly available chargers. And we can look at the fraction of dwellings in each of these areas that has parking available. And at this scale, what you should be seeing here is noise. You also probably noticing there's quite a few areas in quite rural places that would have 1 there, and that's just because of the way the data is recorded. So if you're selling a many hectares sheep station, you're not writing the number of parking spaces down in the sales report. So that's why there's some yellow out there. And it doesn't look that interesting when you look at this scale, but as you zoom in, and here I'm showing you the very central part of Sydney. So for any of you who have visited us in Sydney before, this is Circular Quay here. This is Darling Harbour. The University of Sydney is this kind of triangle over here. And this is Watson's Bay, which is the mouth of the harbour. So I'm just showing you some of the land that's south of the harbour. And when you look at this scale, you can see there are very strong spatial variations that have to do with that variation in the built environment and urban form due to historical development patterns. And what you're also probably noticing is that the chargers are not very well aligned with the places that don't have off-street parking. So this is just a way that you can extend those accessibility things and look at the spatial equity around public charging infrastructure and align that to where the need is going to be the greatest. There's not that much point in putting a lot of off-street parking if everybody in that area, putting public chargers is if everyone in that area has access to off-street parking. I'll just keep moving. So this is how people work around not having access to home charging. They buy an electric vehicle anyway and charge it on the street. So these are just some neighborhoods around Sydney that do that. And now I just want to change gears quickly. I'm still talking about using accessibility as a framework for EV deployment, but now I'm talking about fleet electrification and particularly how you can use these same concepts around prioritizing electrification of bus routes. Sydney's in the process of electrifying its bus routes, and it's doing that contract area by contract area. The contract areas are aligned with the depots, so that's a logical way that you would do electrification because the charging infrastructure would appear at the depots, so all of the routes being served from that depot would be electrified at the same time. So this is how we used accessibility to conceptualize how you should pick which routes need to get electrified first. So in this little schematic, the blue dots are bus stops, and the people who live in the pink circles around the blue dots are people who have access to that bus stop. They're, say, within 800 meters of the bus stop, and they get to ride the bus and have all the benefits of having that bus. The people who live in the blue wavy corridor those are the red houses, are people that have a bus driving past them, but they are not close enough to the bus stop where it's actually useful to them. So they are experiencing all of the disbenefits of the bus, which we would mainly think of as local pollution and noise, but they are not experiencing the accessibility benefits of those buses. And then the people outside of that, the dark gray ones, we just call them not impacted because they're experiencing neither benefit nor disbenefit from those buses. So this is still accessibility framework, but done at a slightly different scale. And this is what it looks like when we imagine each of those little pink circles around the bus stops. These are the catchments. And if that particular bus stop is served by many arrivals, if there's high frequency for the buses, then it becomes dark red. If there aren't many buses arriving there, then it's light red. And so this is a way of visualizing the spatial distribution of the benefit or the utility that is conferred by access to bus stops. If we instead think about the disutility, that's still going to be proportional to the bus frequency, so the number of buses traveling that route, but that disbenefit is experienced along the length of the route rather than just at the circles. And so once we've got those two concepts in our mind and we see them as spatial concepts, then we layer those on top of the population distribution. And we say, well, a bus that should be electrified is one where the number of people experiencing disbenefit, noise, and local pollution is high compared to the number that are experiencing benefit. And so that is what this looks like. These are census areas, census mesh blocks, where we have looked at the disbenefit. So it's the number of trips that pass through times the number of people that live there and experience those pass-throughs. And so we can start to pick out with our eyes that there are these corridors where people are experiencing a lot of disbenefit from just having noisy, smelly, possibly dirty buses driving past and not stopping to give them a ride. This is a way that we can look at the difference between the benefit and the disbenefit. So how many people are experiencing the noise without experiencing the accessibility benefit, and divide it by the number of people. And so this is, I think, what we would think of as a normalized potential improvement. And once again, this is a spatial distribution, and each of these areas is associated with a number of residents that live there and experience it. And so we can create from this a little table, if we would like to, where we're interested in ones that have a high ratio, meaning there's a lot of disutility with potential to improve if that line were electrified. So each of these rows is a route in the Sydney bus network. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Sydney, but the thing that you'll notice is that most of these routes are in fact train replacement routes. So the routes that are created in order to serve train lines when they're having track work undertaken or something. And the reason why they are singled out as being very strong ratios is because trains have large stop-to-stop distances. So there are a lot of people that then experience that length of bus where it's not stopping to pick you up, but you are still experiencing all the noise and the local pollution from it. Okay, so that is just a demonstration of how those same concepts of accessibility can be turned to a different application, which is prioritization of electrification of the fleet. And that brings me back to where I started, which is that the charging infrastructure problem and the battery technology problem, this chicken and egg thing, which one is going to come first? They interact, and what we discovered is that in the New South Wales context, the charging infrastructure limitations were not that high. We had sort of, with the battery technologies that were existing even in 2018 and the charging infrastructure that we have today, we have kind of already addressed that problem. But what is left behind are all of these other issues. So, for example, a major one is that not everybody has a new top-end electric vehicle. The vehicles that were purchased in 2010 or 2014 that have these sort of strong equity considerations are now being sold in secondhand markets, and as they trickle down, may eventually become stranded assets. There's still a lot of human behavior that goes into this idea that we would even have people beginning their day with a full charge on their vehicle, and whether or not they're going to be at home during the day to take advantage of that charging. And then, of course, the tie-in with that as Australia greens its energy markets as well, which is a current hot topic in Australia. So there's a lot that's going on there. In terms of the research that my group and my colleagues are undertaking, the sort of immediate next steps have to do with queuing that's occurring at the public chargers. Like, we know that spatially they're well distributed, there are enough of them, but that doesn't mean that when you show up, it's necessarily going to be working and you're going to be the only one there and be able to use it. There's a lot of interest in curbside charging, with a few areas deploying curbside charging in residential neighborhoods, and that's got a lot of political will and social license issues that go into it. The work around taking advantage of Australia has quite a strong presence of rooftop solar, very sunny country as well, and using that most effectively, possibly through neighborhood batteries, and then the role that road user chargers and rego discounts would take in incentivizing people to switch to electric vehicles. And that is, once again, quite a political, timely issue in New South Wales. So I will stop there and leave my contact details on the screen.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was really fascinating. Thanks a lot. So we still have some time for Q&A. So we have already received some excellent questions, but if you have further questions, do send them through the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through at least most of them. But maybe we can kick off with briefly discussing the kind of the energy source for EV charging. So solar power can be seen as a very prominent kind of prominent source of power in Australia, right? I understand that you have also looked into kind of using this as an energy source for EV charging, and what the implications for that is. So maybe you want to briefly talk us through that as well. Thanks.
Great. So I guess I'll start with a little bit of background. Australia is a coal-rich country, and our energy grid historically has been extremely coal-heavy. So I probably should have mentioned that for a long time, there was no point in having an electric vehicle from a carbon emission standpoint if you were going to be charging it from the grid, because the grid was coming from black coal. That has started to shift quite strongly in maybe just the last 5 years, and is something that's ongoing. And there's been probably now 10 years of push towards rooftop solar. So there's very good deployment of rooftop solar in residential neighborhoods. The question that we were interested in, that we were looking at, is it's a great idea that you could have rooftop solar. Everybody can charge at home and have green energy in their vehicles. But is the car going to be at home during the day in order to take advantage of that? I actually do have some slides that maybe I can here, maybe Something like this. So this is some data that we had from Sydney that is showing the EV load. That's the blue line. That's showing when the electric vehicle's charging. It's showing in the green line the photovoltaic generation. So that's when the sun is shining. And then the orange line is showing the total load. So that's the entire household consumption, and EV would just be part of that. So that's the
Sorry, we
summation.
can't see the slides if you were.
See slides. Interesting. Try that again. How does that look?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, great. So
Now we know what. Yeah.
yeah, blue is the EV load, green is the PV generation, and orange is the total household. And we have this for just over 100 households in New South Wales, every 5 minutes data for about 15 months. And what we found is that a small minority of people are actually charging their EVs when the sun is shining. And if you think about it, that makes sense because you often don't have your car at home during the day. You have the car elsewhere. So the kind of extension of this work, which isn't complete yet, has to do with using travel diary data to understand where people are during the day. And then that speaks into the kinds of incentives and markets that would make sense for people to charge at their workplace, charge at a third destination like shopping or healthcare facilities, wherever they are during the day, versus charging at home. And also the opportunities, if you're not going to charge at home, maybe you're still willing for someone else to charge from your home. So for example, the person on the left here, you can see that around 10 a.m., their household was using very little energy. They were actually generating and therefore dumping quite a bit of photovoltaic energy that maybe could have charged someone else's EV at that time.
Thanks. Okay, let's dig into some of the questions. I think let's try to get through at least most of them. So we have some, perhaps we can start with a couple of questions from Lloyd, right? So we have in New South Wales, this is on the charging infrastructure. Is it mostly publicly financed, or is there also a fair amount of privately financed chargers? And I'll take a couple of more questions and then hand over to you. You can also see the questions, right, Emily, on
Yeah.
the Q&A function. Yes, and then the idea of the okay, yeah. So Lloyd finds the community-based charging systems interesting. So is this done by the local government? And then finally, does Sydney have an electric bike share system? Since much of the last mile travel is usually done through micromobility in urban areas. So those are the first batch of questions for you.
Right. Okay, so New South Wales has a mix. The data that I was showing in the slides is what the New South Wales government presents as publicly available chargers. So to make that list, it has to be available to anybody, obviously for price. We didn't look at the variation in prices across the chargers. The reason we were doing that work at that time is because the state had launched an electric vehicle strategy, and part of that was a program supporting the development of more publicly available chargers. So now we get into this interesting mix of public-private. So this is the program was to support costs of building or creating a charger on your land that you would then be required to make publicly available. And so this was just one of the many portfolios in that strategy. And so those would be private land with public financing for building, but not for upkeep of the chargers. So I guess I'll just leave it there with it's quite complicated. the community-based charging systems. Yeah, so community batteries, this is something that the people in the energy market space are very excited about. I would say that it is not being done, categorically not being done by local government in Australia. It is being considered by energy providers. And yeah, it's interesting. Let me just pivot from that to a similar question. So when the local government started considering curbside charging, and the last I checked, I knew of two local governments that had done this in New South Wales, one in Victoria and one in New South Wales, and I'm sure there are more by now. The issue is that to make this available, the council was needing to take possession of the poles and wires in order to make this charging space available. And the council is not in the business of maintaining poles and wires. So it does create this sort of scope creep for local government that, maybe they want to take this on because it fits with their sustainability strategy, it fits with their mobility strategy, maybe it even addresses some social equity concerns that they have. So you can see why the local government would take it on, but it does create this sort of, oh, now they've got this pull that they need to take care of. So I think the community batteries issue would have similar implications where the local government in some ways is the right person, the right entity to take it on, and in other ways is not in a good position to take it on. And the third one, e-bikes. Oh, e-bikes. So Sydney at the moment does have several e-bike systems running at the moment. There were bike share and then they got banned and then they were back. In terms of micromobility, New South Wales and Australia in general has really struggled with regulation, particularly around e-scooters. So e-scooters have been banned in New South Wales, but despite that, there are about half as many e-scooters in New South Wales as there are adults in the population. So you probably can't make those numbers reckon, but that's sort of the reality of what we've got here, a widespread use of micromobility, despite the fact that it's not so tightly regulated or in some cases exactly banned. In terms of the e-micromobility as a first last mile system, as my experience as a resident of Sydney, I do not think that is the primary use of e-bikes in Sydney. E-bikes are great for Sydney. The climate is well suited. The hilliness and the humidity suit e-bike riding. So e-bikes are quite popular. You see a lot of people using e-bikes in denser neighborhoods as a family vehicle. That's what my family does. But I would say the predominant use, and there is some work coming out of Monash in Melbourne about this, the predominant use of bike infrastructure is e-bikes associated with food delivery. So I would say not particularly strong on the transit access front.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. We're running a bit over time, but if you have time, Emily, we could stay on and try to get through most of the questions that have come in. So feel free to stay, all of you. I think we're trying to finish at least before 4 p.m. Manila time. So there are more kind of technical questions here from Isra Malabanan. So on the battery ranges, when you on your kind of the research that you conducted, do the maps show a single trip to the activity opportunities, or do they also include the return trip back from that activity, which would obviously then cut in half the battery range, basically. There's another question as well. Yes, did you only consider public chargers or also planned or proposed charging infrastructure? So existing public chargers or also planned or proposed. And then travel time. Did you also do some studies on how travel time versus considered distance would be affecting those graphs?
Great questions. Okay, so yeah, the maps are about single trips, not return trips, and absolutely so it would half the battery range. The assumption that we were making is if you're driving 500 kilometers, you can charge at your destination, even a slow charge, an overnight charge. Because that is a long way to drive and come back. So that was kind of our rationale in considering only single. But once again, it's an assumption. And I think it's really kind of piggybacking on the assumption that you have the ability to charge at home and you have the ability to charge at your destination. I'll also just comment that the average distance driven in Australia in a day is about 9 kilometers. So, there's this technical question of do we need to worry about battery range? But there's also this kind of question of why are people so worried about battery range? And it's sort of a separate question. In terms of the chargers that we considered, so all the stuff I showed you was either no charge or the existing public chargers. And when I say existing, they were the ones that existed in 2022. When we started the work. We did all of the analysis also with the published set of planned and proposed charging infrastructure, but I just didn't bring it to show you because the equity convergence was so strong even with the existing charger. I think, yeah, I didn't bring that stuff to show you, but we have it, absolutely. Distance versus travel time. Okay, so there's two issues with distance versus travel time. The battery ranges are generally reported in kilometers. Obviously, there's certain conditions where your battery range is shorter or longer depending on how you're driving, and that ties into travel time. That ended up getting a little bit complicated to deal with that. And so we set it aside and did not consider the fact that you might, deplete your battery faster in certain driving conditions. In terms of actually using travel time and considering the charging time, yes, absolutely. So that's a good question. So this is a little bit of a sneaky thing. Like, how can we say that it's equitable when it's only equitable if the unlucky people have to stop and charge? So absolutely, that is a consideration. That is not something that we looked at here, but the convergence would be much slower, and that's because the people who are taking advantage of the longest range, the sort of 500 plus 500 range, they're also going to, in addition to the fact that they're driving forever, would also have to stop and charge in that time. The charging, so one of the programs in the New South Wales electric vehicle strategy was about what they call destination chargers, and destination chargers were trying to create a network through rural and regional areas. And the marketing around this was sort of supporting the idea that, you can go on a road trip. So it wasn't really the people living in the regional areas, this is your charging infrastructure. But if you live in Sydney and you're taking your Tesla out for a weekend road trip, don't worry, you can do that because we've got these strategic chargers. So actually, yeah, a lot of those destination chargers were fast chargers because they were sort of targeting this stop and have lunch in this nice town and charge your vehicle and then keep driving so that you can have that weekend away. I'm not sure if I quite answered that question, but those good questions, yeah.
Thanks, Emily. We have a couple more from Robin Hughes. He's asking about the range extenders that are running on renewables, such as biodiesel, which are now apparently in most new EVs manufactured in China, those are fitted with these range extenders. Did you consider, or have you considered the adoption of this kind of technology? And also on the fast charging, Robin is mentioning that it's some people in the engineering community see fast chargers as a bad thing for battery life and efficiency. Would you have a comment on that?
Okay, yeah. So work does not consider range extenders. I think there's sort of no reason to think of those any differently. So if you have range extender and it increases your range and it does that through biodiesel, we wouldn't consider that any differently. Whatever range you end up with, if that ends up being considerably farther than 500 kilometers, then that would just extend those plots in the same way. So yeah, that's a possibility. We also sort of avoided the entire question in general of hybrid vehicles, and just said, we're doing this modeling for battery electric. But yeah, there's no reason why the findings wouldn't be related. Fast charging, bad for battery life and efficiency. I don't have a comment to make about that. I think there are so many questions about how people are going to charge their vehicles, about whether they're going to be doing fast charging, about whether they are even going to be trying to charge to full. Like, when you're using a vehicle to go on a road trip, obviously you fill your petrol tank to full because you don't want to stop. And if you are trying to drive an electric vehicle on a road trip, you would charge the battery to full. And so there's a motivation to use fast charging in that context. If you are at home going about your day-to-day life, is there any reason why you would try to charge it every day? And how full would you want to keep your battery? Would you let it sort of degrade over time? Would you plug it in by default? We have some data like the data that I showed you guys, and we can see some interesting patterns of what people are doing with their vehicles, how they're charging their batteries. What we don't know from this data is how much they're driving in between. And then also the questions about what kind of technology they're using for smart charging. So I think it's an interesting question. There's a behavioral component to that, which is how much thought and maybe emotional energy are EV owners willing to put into optimizing their performance of their vehicles? How much can the engineers creating these vehicles take that out of their hands so that it's not an issue? And I think that the role of the charging infrastructure doesn't need to play a big role in that. Like, I wouldn't say that as we roll out EV chargers, that we should say, oh, you can't have fast chargers because they're bad for your battery. I think that decision needs to happen at the manufacturer and the traveler level. Yeah, that would be my comment about that.
Thanks, Emily. We have one more final question here. So it's relating to the bus fleets or operators. So the impact on bus route electrification. So often bus operators tend to prefer charging overnight at depot, assuming energy is cheaper then, right? And I'm not fully sure so they're not using the vehicle to grade potential when doing that, or linking with electrified rail infrastructure, if I understand this comment correct. So does your research on bus fleet electrification touch upon the better integration of grid development work and public transport electrification deployment?
These are great questions. I love this stuff that has to do with, all the intricacies of the behaviors and the stakeholder incentives to do various things. Absolutely right. Most of the buses are out on the road during the day because that's why we have the bus fleet. So they're not at the depots to do the charging. And of course, it makes sense to charge those buses overnight. I didn't look at that at all in this work. One of my colleagues, John Nelson, who's at ITLS, the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies at University of Sydney, has been looking at some questions around that. So I'll maybe point you towards that work. I think the solutions that I've seen in various contexts include trying to do sort of micro charging at stops or, you know, at turnaround points, for example, at the terminus point. And then, of course, integrating some sort of light charging into the vehicles or even overhead catenaries so that the vehicles can charge along the route. But I mean, these are big decisions that go into all kinds of contractual questions and what makes sense. But yeah, it is a complicated question, and it wasn't covered in the work I shared today.
I think we are running out of time. So thank you so much, Emily. I think this session was highly informative. Thank you, everyone, for these really interesting questions, great questions that you sent in. I think it was a really great discussion we managed to have here. So yeah, thanks everyone. Next or in 2 weeks, we'll have our next webinar on geofencing with Professor Mubin. I added the link to that webinar in the chat. So, and we will be sharing invites today through Outlook as well to our mailing list. So, yes, thank you, Emily, again, very, very much for taking the time for presenting this really insightful research, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.